at the National Press Club, Australian Democrat Senator Natasha Stott-Despoja launching the book Collective Wisdom by Brett Kelly. It's the result of interviews with 34 prominent achievers who offer their insight into issues affecting young Australians. Natasha Stott-Despoja and Brett Kelly with today's National Press Club address.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's National Press Club Telstra address. We're very pleased to welcome Senator Natasha Stott-Despoja and Brett Kelly. As you've just heard, Brett has written a book derived from called The Collective Wisdom, and it is the distillation of the thoughts of those Australians that he called upon, one of them being Senator Stott-Despoja. She's not actually launching the book, she's here really to talk about some of the issues it raises and some of the policies that affect young people who are the focus of most of this work. I'll call upon her to speak to you first, and you'll have the chance to ask her questions afterwards, but between her address to you and question time, we'll hear from the author. But first of all, please welcome Senator Stott-Despoja.
Thank you, Ken, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I begin by acknowledging the Ngunnawal people, the traditional owners of this land. And as Peter Garrett says in Collective Wisdom, all the land here, with some exception, was taken illegally by the settlers when they arrived. It wasn't lawfully taken from Aboriginal people, it was illegally taken. Well, it's an honour to speak at the launch of Brett Kelly's book today. Collective Wisdom is about having an idea and making it happen. Brett shares with us the wide-ranging views of 34 Australians. They tell us who or what influenced their lives and talk about their views on issues like republicanism, tax reform, drugs, euthanasia, education, employment and racism. From Professor Gavin Brown's belief that education is about the excitement of ideas and respect for them, to Lindsay Fox's comment that money is a byproduct of job satisfaction. We all have people in public life that we admire. We usually only get glimpses of what lies behind the public face. We wonder what is the drive and the direction that propels them in their accomplishment. I'm particularly pleased to be a part of this launch today because it is a successful youth story. And if it were not for soapy stars or sports stars, there would be few positive images of young people in our newspapers or on our televisions. The easiest way, in fact, for a young person to get coverage in the mainstream media is for them to commit a crime. And as the federal election campaign begins, we can expect to hear about the youth crime wave and policies which seek to criminalise young people, excluding them from public spaces with curfews, move-on laws and sweep operations. It makes you wonder, what is public space for? And aren't young people members of the public? In fact, the way that we manage young people in public spaces has been described as spatial apartheid. This spatial apartheid also exists in some sections of the media. Here's a surf report from the mainstream shock jocks. A story about youth unemployment accompanied by a picture of young people at the beach. If only they were trying harder. Generation X, a lost generation, slackers, drugs and our young people, dole bludgers, our lost youth. A story no parent can afford to miss, indeed. The youth dilemma, it's blamed on lax morals, laziness, latchkey legacies and even a lack of war. But young people need a chance to be a part of sculpting the landscape, not just as a topic of debate, as if they were some distant problem to be talked about but not listened to. Not to allow young Australians a forum in which to express themselves or to allow them to be seen and heard is a big mistake. When was the last time, other than perhaps on Triple J, that you heard a discussion about teenage sexuality, drugs, piercings, skateboarding and blading, graffiti, political demonstrations that wasn't a thinly disguised cover for how can we stop the little delinquents from doing that? Recently, we've seen extraordinary vilification of young people involved in peaceful protest. Now, young people and students have a long history of taking to the streets, often representing cutting-edge political action. We often view with nostalgia the involvement in Vietnam moratoriums, the 1968 student demonstrations in France, or the Tiananmen Square. But when it's our young people, they're described as ignorant, manipulated, and delinquent. Dr. Pat O'Shane, in Collective Wisdom, says, "It seems to me, as a society, we do our level best to alienate our youth." Well, in the last 20 years, we have seen an erosion in the environment in which young people inhabit. Young people are increasingly excluded from society's centre. Now, we often speak of the transition to adulthood. This transition, adolescence, is actually quite a modern concept. In most previous societies, a specific ceremony marked the change from child to adulthood. In modern society, however, growing up has been extended. We're marrying later, we're having children later, we're in education longer, we begin paid work later. Many people have their first drink or their first puff before their first job. The responsibilities and benefits of becoming a full functioning member of our community are being delayed for longer and longer. But there are also specific and intentional government policies which seek to delay recognition of young people as people, not just as beneficiaries of the family and drains on the state. Youth unemployment in Australia is now 29.9%. Now, a number of those people in Collective Wisdom say that there is no acceptable level of unemployment. Some suggest an acceptable level would be around 3%. So we're still talking a rate of almost 10 times that. We've now had shamefully high levels of youth unemployment in this country for over a decade. This has had a dramatic impact on young people's views of themselves, their potential, and their role in Australian society. I want to stress just how unprecedented the circumstances facing young people today really are. In 1922, teenage unemployment, the rate was actually lower than the unemployment rate for adults. Indeed, even in 1931, one of the worst years of the Depression, the teenage unemployment rate in Australia was around 20%. 40 years ago, teenage unemployment was almost non-existent. In fact, in 1947, more than 70% of 15 to 19-year-olds were in the workforce. Today, it's around 17%. Most politicians, when they were young, faced unemployment levels of around 3%. Tell the young people of today that, especially if you're a politician, and they won't believe you. Before the last election, the Prime Minister, in the second televised debate, said in part, "I've developed a plan for youth unemployment. I will actually do something about it. I will ensure that there is some hope offered to those young Australians without a job." Well, a year later, in fact the week that the Work for the Dole scheme was announced, there was the Prime Minister in one newspaper saying, "You owe us." The Prime Minister was here yesterday defending the $10 million that will be spent on advertising a GST. And the Treasurer, Peter Costello, will be here on Friday talking about the 1997-98 budget, coming in at a miraculous $2.3 billion ahead of forecasts. But this government has replaced a budget deficit with a social deficit. In fact, in this government's first budget, nearly all the money came from hitting young people with cuts to programs and higher fees and charges. The last budget contained no measures for job creation and slashed a further $147.6 million from the provision of employment services under Job Network. Work for the Dole was extended and young unemployed people were restricted in the places in which they can live. The budget did make a tax deduction on buying a new suit for your first day of work. So for those who don't get jobs, or as the Youth Affairs Council of South Australia has said, if you're over 65 and if you have the flu, it was an okay budget. The yearly costs of youth unemployment to this nation are around $6 and $7 billion per annum. The social costs, of course, to a generation are immeasurable. But rather than finding solutions to youth unemployment, or at least recognising that in some circumstances it's beyond young people's control, many young people are being blamed for being unemployed. In Collective Wisdom, Hugh Mackay says, "We're going through a period of blaming unemployed people for being unemployed. Get a haircut, get a job. It's blamed on graffiti and piercings and grunge, public schools and migrants, and that saying, well, why don't you just get a job at McDonald's? Well, I'm sorry, there just aren't enough fries to go around." The answers? Keep a dole diary, dob in a dole bludger hotline, work for the dole, and the Common Youth Allowance, all programs targeted at young people. And all of these sending those messages that young people are something to be scared of, that they may be untrustworthy, that they need to be coerced into work or education. Well, there are extraordinary changes taking place in the area of income support with the introduction of the Common Youth Allowance. Now, the greatest danger of this CYA is that those who are unable to participate in educational training for various reasons, those who are already marginalised in multiple ways, will be forced over the edges of the system. The same government which has brought you increased HECS, upfront university fees and savage cuts to university and schools funding now requires young people to stay at school until they complete Year 12 in order to be eligible for income support. Schools with inadequate funding will be forced to cater for students who don't want to be there. So the Common Youth Allowance is an attempt to reduce, artificially, the teenage unemployment statistics by directing young people into education places without changing the reality that a lot of these young people are seeking work and the independence that that brings. And this certainly reduces the pressure on government to actually adopt policies that create jobs for young people. I'm not against education and training, of course. In fact, there's a scene from the movie Primary Colours where the presidential candidate tells the crowd that they're going to have to use the muscle between their ears, that he would commit to providing opportunities for lifelong education, but they're going to have to do the heavy lifting themselves. Well, young people in this country are already doing the heavy lifting. Over the last 10 years, retention rates to Year 12 have increased from 49% to 71%, and this is before the introduction of the Common Youth Allowance. Young people in this country have clearly made the effort, and the government should not be penalising them further. As many as 33,250 young people have now had their benefits reduced. 13,500 have lost their benefits completely. And these are the government's own figures. So in reality, there may be more. Some young people are going to have their benefits adjusted to such a small income that they may just drop out anyway, and some may be knocked out because of the administrative and paperwork confusions. The Common Youth Allowance also reveals serious anomalies in categorisation of independence with other government programs such as the Family Tax Initiative, family payments and the Child Support Scheme, which they're based on a principle that young people are no longer dependent on the family once they reach the age of 18 years. So that's a period of up to 7 years where the coalition is having its tax cake and its welfare cuts too. There is a social agenda here. The government wants families to take more responsibility for their adult children up until the age of 25 in the case of students. But if families don't or can't, those who suffer most will be young people. The Common Youth Allowance presumes an idealised model of the family, sometimes referred to as the 1950s model, but the 1990s reality doesn't fit that model. The Common Youth Allowance assumes that families are safe places, and if they are not, that can be proven. It assumes that young people choose to leave home and does not recognise that sometimes home leaves them. As Father Chris Riley of the Youth Off the Streets mission has commented in Collective Wisdom, to be a street kid means that normally you're abused so badly at home or in your local neighbourhood that you have no choice but to leave home and live on the streets. 95% of the girls and 90% of the boys that we deal with have been sexually abused. This has often happened at home, in their own neighbourhood, or by someone they should have been able to trust. Well, abuse is not a 90s phenomenon. It can't be blamed on technology or migrants or the economic crisis or even El Nino. The idealised 1950s family didn't always exist in the 1950s either. But youth unemployment was less than 2% then, and the option was there for young people to leave home, get a job, make their own lives and start their own families. That's now a lot harder to do. Certainly we should encourage young people to increase their skills, to better their chances in the job market. But let's not forget that we need stimulation of the job market as well. Presently it's not so much a job market as a job vending machine with a sign that's saying out of order. There's no way around it. We need to create jobs. Now, in Collective Wisdom, Hugh Mackay also states, the real issue is not what we're going to do about all these unemployed people. The issue is how are we going to distribute the available work among available people. Peter Garrett, in his contribution, says we need people, from replanting trees and getting our native forests back to order, to looking after the elderly, to assisting the development of industries, to being involved in creative areas. There is a great deal that we could and should be doing, and we need people to do those things. The government could take action to create youth jobs. They could link funding for special projects onto the condition that, say, 10% of positions created are targeted at young people. They could at least choose to reverse the trend in the public sector and public service employment, where fewer and fewer young people are working. The government has cut labour market programs. They've cut public sector jobs, and there is still no jobs creation policy other than we're waiting for the economy to catch up. Now, I don't want to suggest that young people are merely passive victims of circumstances. All the time, young people strike back with sarcasm, irony, and the remote control. But they're also prepared to boycott a system that does not listen to them. Research shows that 65% of 18 to 24-year-olds have experienced no political engagement whatsoever, and only 2% have ever belonged to a political party. A significant number of young people say they're not prepared to tick a box at election time, and more than 1 in 4 of 18 to 25-year-olds who are eligible to vote are not enrolled to do so. And that suggests that half the 18-year-olds who are eligible are not enrolled to vote. So I congratulate Triple J on their rock and roll campaign that they're running in an attempt to reverse this trend. But young people feel that the issues that affect them are not being acted upon, and as polls reveal, they don't have a lot of faith in politicians. One survey has found that only 6% of Year 11 students believe politicians are honest, and 66% doubt governments care about what people think. In Youth Poll 98, when asked who do they trust to inform them politically, only 2% of young people nominated politicians and 17% nominated the media. I began the Democrat Youth Poll as an annual national survey of young people's views in 1992. It's now in its 7th year, and we asked them this year their views on a range of issues from republicanism to racism to immigration levels, employment opportunities, and even who should be the first president of an Australian republic. Around 2/3 thought we should move to a republic, and even more, 82%, wanted a referendum on the issue. Only 1% thought that a future president should be chosen by the Prime Minister, with 72% saying that they should be elected by popular vote. I should add that one young person commented, "I wouldn't trust this Prime Minister to choose the first Australian president. I wouldn't trust this Prime Minister to choose the entree." It is sometimes said that young people are not interested in politics, but the reality is that sometimes politics is not interested in young people. With the average age of members of Parliament being 49 years, there are no federal politicians under the age of 25, and apart from myself, there are no others under the age of 30. Young Australians do not have their fair share of power. Young people under 18 cannot vote, and thus it's even more important that they have an effective representative body. The Democrats condemned the recent decision by the government to defund the National Representative Organisation for Young People, the Australian Youth Policy and Action Coalition, APAC. That was a political decision. The government is not cutting because they have to, they're cutting because they want to. Good government requires good critics, and again, we're shooting the messenger. This is despite the fact that we've actually had a peak national body in this country for 20 years. Successive governments have been able to work with the peak youth affairs body, but not this one. This can only be seen as a political decision to silence the voice of the youth sector. And APAC's funding stopped the same day that the Common Youth Allowance was introduced in this country. the government is coming down hard on those who can't vote back. Well, young people deserve a greater say in our future. They deserve a government with imagination and vision, and I'm not simply talking about tax reform. We have to think about the future, the big issues. Issues like anti-racism and the Republic are issues young people show a great deal of commitment to. And we have to ask, when we sell off our public assets, whose future are we really selling out? It's often said that young people are our future, but the reality is they're part of our present. They're here and now, and they deserve to have their voices heard. Brett asked his interviewees the most critical issue facing Australia today. There were various answers: the Republic, reconciliation, abortion, the environment, globalism, unemployment, education, technology, a crisis of leadership. In fact, H.G. Nelson said pig shooting, but I think he was kidding. Pat O'Shane said greed and individualism, and I'm pretty sure she was serious. I was struck by Mark Ehler's comments, the footballer. Social welfare, the difference in social classes. It is true that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. He went on, we are not giving, in terms of the social environment, a fair opportunity for every young child. Those whose benefit, parents who've got the most money, get the best education, the best opportunities. Those that live in poorer suburbs are being basically neglected by this government. Out of the mouths of footballers. So I congratulate Brett on raising these issues for discussion through these interviews. Collective Wisdom is an interesting book, but the story behind the book of Brett's determination is perhaps the story that needs to be heard. Thank you for your attention and the opportunity to address you on youth issues.